G'day everyone, you're watching Kath with a K, and I'm Kath. Welcome to my metal/punk aesthetic. We've got a dark room, we've got coloured hair, a leather jacket, and my latest knitting project in the background. So I have heard the sentiment from some people, definitely not people in my own generation, but people in, say, my parents' generation and maybe older, that metal music is violent and that it leads to violence and is not healthy to listen to. And I was thinking about this the other day and I wanted to investigate what research there is into this. Now, as I started looking into this and researching it, I realized that there were a lot of different aspects to what could make a certain genre seem violent or seem like it causes violence. There's, the listeners and what effect it has on the listeners, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. And then there's what the musicians themselves do, which is what I'm going to be looking at more in next week's video. So I am aware that there are many instances of metal musicians doing violent things and committing crimes, such as especially in the Norwegian black metal scene, which kept coming up in my research. But that's going to be a bit beyond the scope of today's video, and I will be talking about that next week. The way I'm going to structure this video is first I'm going to talk about my own experiences with metal music, then I'm going to talk about some examples of how media has blamed metal music for mental health issues or crimes, then I'll look into the research for positive effects of metal music, then the research on negative effects for metal music, and this is on listeners, and then just talk about conclusions and my own thoughts after having looked at the research. And I also want to say that I couldn't look at very many studies in depth because a lot of them I don't have access to because I'm not part of some research institution or anything, and they're like $50 for each study. So I'm going to talk about a few studies in depth and then briefly mention some of the ones that I saw that existed but did not have access to. Okay, so my own experiences with metal. I would say that about half the music I listen to is something that is borders between hard rock and alternative metal, and there's a bit of heavy metal as well. And the other half is mostly Celtic music. I am not a violent person. I have never assaulted anyone, harmed anyone, committed any serious crimes or anything like that. And I know a few other people who listen to metal music and who listen to much heavier music than I do, such as black metal or death metal, and they are well-adjusted people. I would say I'm a well-adjusted person as well. In my childhood, I actually wouldn't listen to a lot of music. I played a lot of piano and flute, but I would just play whatever my instrument teachers gave me to play. And I would say that I was taught mostly by my parents to kind of try to not be emotional and to hide my feelings, and that no one wants to know what I'm feeling. So I never really learnt how to express my emotions properly, I suppose, in my childhood. And then eventually I came across some rock music that was somewhat heavy, and I was like, oh, this kind of coincides with some of my feelings, and I eventually, explored that and ended up listening to things like, I Hate Everything About You by 3 Days Grace and that sort of stuff, and some of the older Linkin Park. And I felt like if I was feeling angry or sad, I would listen to that and be like, yes, someone gets me. And it's not just someone saying like, just shut up. No one wants to listen to your feelings, and no one else feels like that either. But you listen to metal music and it's like, oh, these people feel like that as well. So I felt like hard rock and metal music definitely helped me in that journey and to learn about emotions and to get more in touch with what I'm feeling actually. So I feel like it was a very positive influence in my life. So when I hear people talking about metal music causing violence and stuff, to me that's such a foreign concept, and I also don't see that in the people that are directly around me, but I suppose I also would be friends with people who are similar to me to some extent. And now the media and metal music. I have heard about, art or entertainment being blamed for violence, mostly in the form of video games being blamed for violence, and I've less so heard about music being blamed for violence. So I've now found top 9 times rock music was blamed for tragedies, and I thought we could take a little bit of a squiz at it. Back in the early 2000s, a man from Colorado, who shall be unnamed, confessed to killing 6 people, and during his confession and some interviews, stated that metal music, especially Linkin Park and Metallica, was what led him to such violent acts. He also claimed that violent video games caused him to act out the murders. I would probably disagree. I think it takes someone who is already quite disturbed and far gone to do something like that. You can't just listen to one song and be like, yeah, I want to kill someone now. Drowning Pool's Bodies was blamed for the infamous 2011 shooting rampage in Tucson, Arizona. And this was not even the first time that this song was accused of inducing violence. Back in 2003, a teenager shot his parents while listening to the song. And then after the Columbine High School massacre, a lot of fingers were pointed at Manson. And this actually led to him cancelling the rest of his North American tour. And headlines were run during this time, such as devil-worshipping maniac told kids to kill. And there are a bunch of other examples like this as well. So let's start looking at the research now and see if there is any basis there for these claims that this music could be causing violence. So the first thing I read was a bit of a literature review about metal music and its effects on the emotional well-being of adolescents. It found that for the majority of adolescents, listening to music, no matter what type of music it was, had a positive effect on their mood, and that adolescent music preferences seem to be associated with their psychological profile. So it can reflect their developmental needs, individualism level, family and friend relationships, and perceptions of themselves. Fans of heavy metal, punk, hip hop, and other heavy music were found to use music for emotional regulation more than people who are fans of other music, and preferring certain music could be interpreted as red flags for certain psychiatric problems, but it could be because preferring certain types of music reflects underlying vulnerabilities that someone already has. There were a lot of studies that found correlations between certain behaviors or issues and certain genres of music, but it is a bit more difficult to find a causal relationship. Now, one study looked specifically at self-reported anger after listening to heavy metal music, and they found that people who identified as fans of heavy metal did not have any difference in self-reported anger after listening to their preferred genre or a non-preferred genre. However, people who weren't fans of heavy metal did say that they were more angry after listening to heavy metal compared to music type that they preferred. But there was no clarification within the parameters of the study whether it was because of the intrinsic properties of the music or because they were listening to something they didn't enjoy. I managed to access a primary study that tested the problem music causes anger idea. What they called problem music in this study was basically what the general public perceives as problem music. So that was heavy metal, punk, hip hop, rap, and alternative music, which I feel like is very broad. So if it were true that problem music causes anger, then participants in the study would feel more angry after listening to aggressive music. This study did have a small sample size. They only had 39 participants and they were between the ages of 18 and 34. 72% of the participants were male, and that is a bit of a common theme throughout these studies where more of the people who prefer heavy metal music tend to be men. For this particular study, the recruits were people who said that they enjoyed listening to one or more extreme genres of music such as heavy metal, and they listened to that type of music for at least 50% of the time that they listened to music. Once they were recruited, the participants underwent a stress interview where they described events that made them very angry over the course of 16 minutes, and their heart rates were measured so you could see that their heart rates increased and all of that sort of thing. The control group then sat in silence for 10 minutes, while the experiment group was told to listen to music of their choice for 10 minutes. Their heart rate was monitored, as well as them being asked before the anger induction, after the anger induction, and after the period of silence or listening to music about their feelings of stress, irritability, hostility, relaxation, and inspiration. So interestingly, heart rate seemed to be fairly sustained for the people who were listening to heavy music, whereas those in the silence group, their heart rate dropped back down to a lower level after being in silence. Due to the small sample size, though, the margin of error does make it a bit unclear how much of this result could be due to chance, and for most of the self-reported measures such as feelings of hostility, there was no significant difference found between the control group and the music listening group. The one condition that did show a difference was inspiration. So those people who listened to so-called problem music reported feeling a lot more inspired than those who sat in silence. Now, the researchers themselves did say in their discussion, something which I was thinking of myself, that it would be interesting to see how this compares to listening to lighter music, because, you know, this might have just been the effect of listening to music in general rather than specifically heavy music. Also, one problem with this study is that they recruited people by saying they're looking for the potential benefits of extreme music. That could definitely bias the results, but I was kind of surprised that there wasn't more of a difference in the other measures, like, you know, feelings of anger and such, because I felt like, given the fact that they were told they were looking for potential benefits, I probably would have expected them to say like, yeah, I feel so calm after this or something like that, but that didn't really seem to be the case compared to the control group. Another study interviewed 17 cancer patients who said that they used music to cope with their illness, and 2 of the patients were talking about using heavy music more specifically, so their thoughts were shared in this article that was specifically about heavy music. These patients emphasized finding a source of meaning and easing their anger, anxiety, and sadness. The first patient, Helen, was very depressed after her breast cancer operation, and she couldn't continue her education because of this, and her boyfriend ended up leaving her as well. So she began listening to heavy metal music after this. She says this music had helped her realize that her dreams about her life and the world were illusory, that life was not just and as sacred as she had once believed, that the world was full of injustice, and that people everywhere suffered from injustice, prejudice, and discrimination. She explained that she began to understand that there was no special meaning of human life, and thinking in this way made her relax, because this new outlook helped her stop regarding cancer as a murderer who had killed her life and dreams. I began to realize that it's no problem that I have no dream, no ambition, and no goals anymore, that it was even good that I didn't see any special meaning with my life. This music gave me a new goal, to be goalless, to be different from ordinary people who stress themselves to death in order to reach a goal. For some years, the meaning of my life was to have no meaning, no goal, no dream, no expectations for my future, and only to be. Another patient, Sarah, got cancer at 8 years old, and the principal problem she had during and after her cancer period was the lack of conversation about her situation. She did not react to her feelings, as she had lost contact with them while trying to live up to the expectation of others. You make the feeling more intense with the music. It's like it creates a resonance between the feelings and the music you hear, something like an interplay between feelings and the music, and it becomes easier to bear the feeling. Afterwards, you feel kind of calm. Music helped me enter a world where I was free to be bad, no rationality, no kindness, no obedience and dependency, and to be free. In this world, my world, I could shout at them and even hurt them. It was thanks to this invented world that I could come back to the real world again and be that nice, understanding, sick girl. And in the author's conclusion, she says that the music may also create an imaginary world in which the patient has a new identity. In such a case, the patient actually lives in 2 worlds. The real one, where they are a humble cancer patient, and an invented one, where they are an aggressive person who destroys everything, and the calmness comes afterwards. Now let's look at some studies that showed either negative correlations or negative effects of metal music, and there did seem to be a few more of these. A review of the literature showed that adolescent heavy metal fans, which were mostly white males, appeared to vary from general adolescents on a lot of behaviours, and there's a bit of a list. High substance use, delinquency, recklessness, depression, lower self-esteem, more strained family relationships, greater school-related problems, and lower socioeconomic status. So some of those findings might be reflected by the fact that adolescent males in general do show more problematic behaviours than adolescent females. But let's look at a study on 121 high school students that took into account gender differences as well. So this study, done on students in year 10 to year 12, They completed the Reasons for Living inventory, which has been found to be a significant predictor of suicidal ideation among 14 to 19-year-olds especially. And then they were given a survey to assess their music preferences and how much music they listen to each week and other things like that. They were also given a suicidal risk questionnaire to assess their suicidality in the past, present, and future. In heavy metal fans, significantly lower Reasons for Living scores were found compared to people who listen to other genres, and this effect stayed the same when the genders were separated. Metal fans had significantly lower scores on several subscales of the Reasons for Living inventory, and these were responsibility to family, survival and coping beliefs, and specifically for males, moral objection to suicide. A significantly greater percentage of heavy metal fans also thought about killing themselves, and for females it was more extreme and more significant than for the male metal fans. Another interesting thing that they looked at in the introduction of the study was heavy metal magazine subscription rates versus rates of suicide. And the trend of subscriptions to heavy metal magazines did actually correlate to youth suicide, but not adult suicide. And this remained even after variables linked to suicide such as divorce rate, poverty statistics, and race were controlled. But there still might be unexamined factors that could be confounding. Also, I forgot to mention, significantly more females in the rock and metal group compared with those in the pop group reported having thoughts of killing themselves and having self-harmed. So 66% of females who listen to rock and metal music versus 35% of females who listen to pop music thought about killing themselves, and 62% of girls who listen to rock and metal music had self-harmed versus 14% of girls who listen to pop music. An important thing to note about this study though is that this does not show a causal link at all, because it was simply a correlation study. So all that this could indicate is that a preference for heavy metal could be a red flag for increased suicidal vulnerability, which I think I also mentioned earlier in the video based on the literature review. So this correlation could totally just come from people who already have a predisposition for these sorts of thoughts and mental health issues are more drawn to metal music. Another study looked at patients admitted into hospitals for psychiatric problems. The music preferences of 470 adolescent patients towards the end of the 80s were compared with participation in problematic behavior, but especially drug use. These patients were roughly half-half boys and girls, and they separated the patients into those who didn't abuse drugs, those who had some drug abuse, and those who were chemically dependent. As drug abuse increased, so did preference for heavy metal music, participation in violent activities, participation in sexual activities, and stealing. And there was definitely quite a significant difference here. And now, while I do believe the conclusion here that there seems to be a correlation between listening to heavy metal music and drug abuse, I think it definitely would have helped to have a control group of people who were not hospitalized for mental health issues and see within the general population of adolescents what's the percentage of preference for heavy metal music. Because there was a previous study that I talked about where I think it was slightly over 50% of college students that were recruited for the study preferred heavy metal music. So if we have a similar amount of people who are chemically dependent liking heavy metal music in a quite similar age range, I suppose university students are a little bit older, then I'm not too sure how strong the correlation will stay when you add in that control group. And you know, the general university population isn't really representative of the general population of people in the age group of like 18 to 21. Anyway, this study on psychiatric patients once again does not show causation, but simply a correlation. Finally, I looked at a study about music therapy, but a lot of it wasn't really relevant to this specific conversation, so I'm only going to talk about some brief points from it. A common perspective in therapy circles is that experiences in early childhood shape attitudes to violence, influencing the individual's temperament and capacity for impulse control. Individuals with a history of violence are likely to have associations between music and violence. and violence-prone adolescents do use music to stimulate and turn up their aggressive feelings and preparedness for aggression. So this was a topic that wasn't really covered in previous studies, which is why I wanted to include it. The researchers for this study reviewed the pre-existing evidence, and they found that, once again, they use the term problem music here, but they found that problem music does not trigger violent behaviors, but it supports, enhances, and intensifies violence that someone already has within them. And music can also be used as a badge of identity, especially in adolescence. So underachieving students may purposely identify with music that represents their sense of failure in the school system to perform identity. So one of the suggestions made for music therapy with aggressive young people is to recognize existing music preferences and collaborate with the young person to become conscious of the links between music and priming violent behaviors. Now, one of the studies that I didn't have access to, and by didn't have access to, I mean that I could read the abstract, but I couldn't read in depth the methodology and such used. One of the abstracts looked at music's effect on level of anxiety in preoperative settings and determined that the most benefit was seen in classical music and meditation music, whereas heavy metal and heavy electronic music could even be dangerous when trying to calm someone down before an operation. And when you link that with the study where they did an anger induction and then monitored the heart rate of people who then listened to heavy music and it was fairly sustained, I guess that makes some sense because you probably don't want to be increasing your heart rate in a preoperative setting. If you're having an operation and you're anxious about it, maybe don't listen to heavy metal music. Another study of 551 university students found higher levels of depression and especially anxiety in heavy metal listeners. Another study had a sample of 275 students who either preferred heavy metal music or worship music, and it did not find a relation to suicidal risk when controlling for other risk factors. But because I don't have access to it, I can't see what those other risk factors were. However, using music for vicarious release in this study was inversely related to suicidal risk for girls. So I guess if you listen to more music to release your emotions, then you're likely to have less of a risk for suicide if you're a girl. That's interesting that they didn't find that in boys. In another study, 164 adolescents completed a personality inventory and measure of music preference. Those preferring heavy or light music as opposed to having an eclectic taste in music had at least moderate difficulty in negotiating certain domains of personality or developmental issues. So their conclusion was that adolescents prefer listening to music that reflects specific personalities and issues that they are dealing with. There was a study with 75 undergraduate males that indicated that exposure to heavy metal music, irrespective of lyrical content, increased males' sex role stereotyping and negative attitudes towards women. But honestly, I'm really surprised by that because it specifically says irrespective of lyrical content. So I am really interested in seeing the methods for this. I'm wondering how exactly they measured that and how they controlled for different things, you know. Finally, a study with over 7,000 students looked at music taste and alcohol and tobacco use. The students were between the ages of 12 and 16. The genres of punk or hardcore, techno or hard house, and reggae were associated with more substance use, while pop and classical showed less substance use. Heavy metal was associated with less smoking among boys and less drinking among girls, though, so that's interesting. So, what can we conclude? Or at least, what am I going to conclude from this? There does seem to be quite a bit of evidence linking mental health issues and listening to heavy metal music. However, we can only see a correlation, and we can't really say that heavy metal music causes mental health problems. You know, I actually started out trying to look for any links between violence and heavy metal music, but a lot of what I ended up with was links between depression and anxiety and heavy metal music. Now, we did look at one study that monitored in real time how people felt after listening to heavy metal music when they were angry before listening to it. And it did show that it either did not have a negative effect, or in one case, in the case of feeling inspired, it actually had a positive effect. And in the interviews with cancer patients talking about why they listen to heavy metal music and how it helps them, they talk about how it matches their emotions and helps them release it. And I also personally have experienced that, and I imagine there are a fair few people who have also experienced that on top of me and the two interviewees. However, there is also a group of people who use heavy or extreme music or problem music to get themselves hyped up to be violent and do violent things and commit crimes. So that is clearly a bit of an issue, but I think it's unclear at this point whether more people use heavy music for positive effects or if more people use it for negative effects, because there seems to be the capacity to use it for a positive effect or to use it for a negative effect. You know, you can either use it to become more in touch with your emotions and to release your anger and to feel more inspired, or you can use it to get yourself hyped up to like hurt people. I would be interested to look at the effect of violent lyrics versus non-violent lyrics in heavy metal music. Like perhaps the people who get a positive experience out of metal music are listening to metal music that is about a certain topic or about a certain group of topics, and people who are using it in a negative way to become more violent are listening to music that is a completely different topic, and maybe there isn't even much of an overlap. Like, who knows? There's plenty of heavy music that doesn't have violent lyrics, which maybe people who don't listen to heavy music don't really think about or realize maybe. Like a song that comes to mind for me specifically is Never Too Late by 3 Days Grace, which probably doesn't classify as metal, but like some sort of hard rock. It is literally about discouraging people from hurting themselves. I would definitely guess that listening to a song like that couldn't really have much of a negative effect. You know, I would be really interested to recruit like a quite large sample size for a study and to basically ask demographic questions. What's your age? What's your gender? Socioeconomic status? You know, are your parents still together? Did they get divorced? And ask about mental health things, like give a DAS questionnaire or something, and look at their Spotify playlists or whatever platform that they listen to music to, and look at what specific songs they listen to and what is the genre of each song, what is the lyrical content, and compare the two. I think that it would probably be difficult to find much of a causal relationship, but I think that the correlations that we are seeing, if we delve deeper into them, find more details for how to identify different levels of risk in people who listen to different sorts of music, I think that that could be really helpful actually to therapists or parents. You know, maybe don't discourage your children from listening to certain types of music, but recognize that if your kid is drawn to heavy metal music or black metal or punk or anything like that, that maybe they're having some sort of issues with perhaps anxiety or maybe their relationship with you, you know? If I'm talking about like a parent looking at their child's music taste, maybe it's kind of an indication that you might need to talk to your kid about like what's going on, like why are you wanting to listen to music about like suicide and destruction. Actually, something that I forgot to mention at the start of the video was I feel like I also had quite a bit of social anxiety growing up, and I feel like that also drew me to metal music. Because people talked about stuff like social anxiety, and it comes specifically to heavy metal music causing violence. It seems that the music just sometimes can be used by people who already have risk factors for violence and violent tendencies to increase their pre-existing aggression, but it's not going to turn someone who, you know, has like a really good family life, hasn't been abused in their life or anything, into someone who commits violent acts. That hypothesis has not been supported. I feel like it was hard to come up with a very succinct conclusion to this because it kind of looked at a lot of different areas of what metal music might be correlated to or might cause. I hope that you found this interesting and that you learnt something, because I definitely learnt quite a lot while researching this. And if you are not subscribed yet and are interested in my next video, where I will be talking about things such as the Norwegian black metal scene and metal artists encouraging violence versus metal artists who make the distinction between makeup and whatever being just an aesthetic and not indicative of you should act out violence. If you are interested in that video that I will be making next week, then definitely subscribe so you don't miss it. And I'll see you next week.